I want to first begin by sharing a story I heard about a rabbi who was preparing to give a sermon on Yom Kippur. While ascending to the podium to speak, he tripped and he fell flat on his face. The room erupted in laughter. Meanwhile, he picked himself up, went over to the podium and said, "I have just concluded my sermon. The moral is that even when a person falls flat on his face, he can get up again. The important thing is to never give up hope." Now first, let me say that I'm grateful that I made it to this lectern safely this morning, but the truth is, Rabbi Peltz is giving the sermon today, not me. So Rabbi Peltz, I offer my best wishes to you. Remember to watch your step. But in all seriousness, I want to focus on the moral of that rabbi's unique sermon. The important thing is to never give up. I spoke a bit about hope in my Rosh Hashanah sermon, and I would like to return to the topic again today. I guess it's been on my mind a lot recently. Hope feels a bit harder to come by these days. But what is hope? The hope that I am talking about is much more than the hope found in sappy movies and in cheesy Hallmark cards. Now, don't get me wrong. If you know me, you know that I certainly love my good sappy movie and cheesy card. But let me suggest that hope is much deeper than "and they all lived happily ever after." To hope is to conceive of things turning out differently than they might, to believe in the possibility of a positive outcome, often in the absence of evidence. Hope sometimes seems like an irrational emotion, a chutzpahdik impulse that others may say is ill-advised or even naive. There's not always a scientific or historical reason to believe that tomorrow will be better than today. In fact, things sometimes do get worse before they get better, a reality that we can certainly understand today in the midst of our COVID-19 pandemic and the political and social unrest in our country. Having hope requires that we take the long view. Now, to be clear, having hope does not mean denying our current existence, but rather defying it. Sociologist Peter Berger called hope a signal of transcendence, something that speaks to us from beyond where we are. Future-focused, hope forces us to squarely face the facts of life, and then to see something beyond them. As such, hope is a uniquely human quality. Living with hope in our hearts entails a kind of dual consciousness, where we at once dwell in the world that is, and at the same time aspire to the world as it might be. Now, hope has been at the core of Judaism throughout the ages. Think about our history as a people. Time and again, we persist. We continue to live our lives. Somehow, from deep within, we have held on tight to the courage to get up and move forward. We continue to have hope, because that is what Jews do. Our national anthem, Hatikva, celebrates the realization of our greatest hope, the land of Israel. And it also represents the hope that we continue to have in our hearts as a people and as individuals. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of the UK, goes one step further, asserting that in a sense, Jews invented hope. Listen to what he writes. "The Greeks gave the world the concept of tragedy. Jews gave it the idea of hope. To be a Jew is to be an agent of hope in a world serially threatened by despair." Where is hope to be found on Yom Kippur? Allow me to suggest this morning that we can draw hope from this morning's ritual-filled Torah reading. We're about to read from Leviticus 16, which contains the ancient Yom Kippur rite. In biblical times, on Yom Kippur, the high priest would take 2 identical goats. One was sacrificed to God, while the other was sent into the wilderness to some unknown place called Azazel. But before the goat was sent away, the high priest placed his hands on its head and confessed all of the sins of Israel upon it. Hope. Imagine the hope each ancient Israelite must have felt as it watched that goat walk off into the distance, a great burden lifted. Hope that the new year could bring a fresh start, a year full of blessings. The important thing is to never give up hope. That's the Yom Kippur ritual described in the Torah. But what about in ancient rabbinic times? How was Yom Kippur observed when the temple stood? The Talmud relates that Yom Kippur was the one day of the year on which one person, the Kohen HaGadol, the high priest, would enter the Kodesh HaKodashim, the Holy of Holies. It was an awe-filled task. Would the Kohen's prayers be accepted by God, and would he reemerge unscathed? One aspect of the ritual that I find particularly fascinating is that there are some sources which suggest that before the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies, a rope was tied to his ankle. Why? One possibility was that if there was a problem, there would be a way to extricate his body. But let me suggest this morning another reason. Hope. The Hebrew word for hope is tikva. The word tikva shares a root with the word kav, which means a thread or a cord. What did the people tie around the Kohen's ankle? A kav, a thread. Hope. They tied hope around his ankle. Hope that his encounter with God would be well received, and hope that the new year would bring life, happiness, health, and blessings. Hope is that cord, or really the thread, that we continue to hold on to during challenging moments in our lives and in our world. Do you ever feel like you are holding on by a thread? Right now, in our world today, it feels like we are holding on by a kav, by a thread. But what would it mean to understand that the thread which remains in our grasp is hope? The kav is in our hands, and hope is in our hearts. A crucial task in the year 5781 is to live with hope in our hearts. Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first chief rabbi of Israel, had a teaching about facing difficult moments. He wrote, "If you find yourself in a dark place, don't waste time cursing the darkness. Instead, light a candle, because that is the Jewish way." Certainly an important lesson. Regardless of whether we are able to see light at the end of the tunnel, regardless of how dark our world may seem, we must hold on to hope. Yes, sometimes we find ourselves hanging by a thread, but may that thread be hope, and may it give us the courage, the energy, and the thrust that we need to light a candle and to keep moving forward. I began by sharing a story of an anonymous rabbi who fell on his face. Maybe he tripped because there was a rope tied to his ankle, a thread of hope. The important thing is to never give up hope. We continue now with our Torah reading, which, as was the case on Rosh Hashanah, will be chanted by our fantastic teens. Chanting Torah for us this morning will be Dara Hamill, Emma Sklar, Michaela Basil, Matthew Matro, Hannah Seitz, Danielle London, and Carly Levine. And we begin with the blessing for the reading and studying of Torah, as we can say together, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Amen.